I'm Shirley Laslett, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Neuroscience of Change as part of this year's Spark Festival. Now, obviously, we're not in person because 2020 has been a pretty interesting year, but what we're going to be talking about today is actually the process of change, and that has been iconic from the beginning of January up until now. I think this year has been unlike any other year that any of us have gone through. So today we're going to be spending a little bit of time unpacking neurologically what happens to our mind when it changes and how this impacts us on an individual level, but also on an external level. So today we'll be going through 4 parts here of the presentation. We'll be talking about the neuroscience of change, and I'm just going to give you your brain basics, a little bit of 101 about how change and also cognition, the way we think, dovetail in together. We'll then be talking about neurohacks, and neurohacks are quick neurohacks or tools that you can use to help accelerate change in a positive way, both internally and externally. And then we're going to end with about anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. So for those that have joined one of these sessions before, you'll be familiar with the platform, but for those of you that haven't, you have a chat function, a Q&A function, and a poll function. Now, the polls will be launched by the awesome SparkFest team in the background. We'll have 2 polls today. We'll also be using the chat function as I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. This is very much an interactive session. So please don't worry about getting it right, because there's no such thing as a silly response. It's all about sharing what you know when we ask. And let's be honest, if it was just me talking for 50 minutes, it would be pretty boring. So just quickly to these neurohacks team, we have these neurotools, which are digital tools which you can access after the presentation. So all of our contact details will be on the last slide. If you do want to access these tools, please do drop us a note and we will send them through. But because we want to take care of everyone's time today and make sure that we get out on time, I'm going to start with talking all about the neuroscience of change. What actually happens to our brain when we go through this mysterious and often uncomfortable process of change? So using the chat function team, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions and I want you to put your responses in the chat. So let's start at the very top. If we think about our job, what do we think our brain's primary job is? Using the chat function, what is our brain's number one job? What must it do at all times? I think we might be a little bit shy there, so we're just going to wait. Using the chat function team, what do you think our brain's number one job is to do? It looks like we're all a little bit shy this morning, so maybe we've got some logging on there. Keep me breathing, Bex, correct. Keep you alive. Your brain's number one job. Solve problems, do keep us alive. Sorry, team, I think there's a bit of delay there. Also, I have a number of screens around me, so if it looks like I'm not looking at you, I'm just looking at your responses on another screen. So back to there now, it is to keep us alive. Now, because of that, we can characterize cognition, our thought processes, into 2 primary states. We have away states, threats, and we have towards states, rewards, things that we desire and are important for our survival. Now, what we need to understand about our brain, because our brain's primary job is to keep us alive, is that away states, threat states, are 4 times stronger than reward. What that means is we're 4 times more likely to see threat and risk in every situation than we are to see reward. Now, again, we're going to ask you a question using the chat function. What do we think our strongest away state is, our strongest threat state? What is our strongest threat state? Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a clue. It's an adjective, describes a behaviour. So, standard, if you think about your away state, so our strongest threat state, connection would be something that we probably want, so we can talk about that later on in the presentation. But what would be our biggest threat? A feeling of threat. Using the chat function, what do you think, team? I think we've got a bit of a delay here, so I'm just going to wait a second. Survival instinct, fear. Okay, so fear is an interesting one. There's a bit of a fine line between pleasure and pain. We need a bit of a fear. Pain also, some of us actually find pleasure in our pain. Some of us enjoy that feeling of discomfort because it motivates us. Death, fear, some people find relief. All right, I'm going to give it to you because this one's a little bit complicated. It is disgust. Now, I know that might seem random, but the reason it's discussed is because it's a very strong afferent bodily feedback that we don't enjoy a situation or we're not safe in a situation. Now, remember, we've come from a time where we didn't used to forage our food from supermarket aisles. We lived in jungles and plains, and so we needed very clear bodily feedback to our brain if we consumed something which wasn't good for us. But this applies to behaviour too. If I'm disgusted by your behaviour, there's no question about how I feel. And this will be really important. We're going to cover this off in the next slide. But let's go to the other side, team, toward the reward side. Using the chat function again, what do you think our strongest toward state is? What do we desire? What's our strongest toward state? Using the chat function, tell me what your team think. What's our strongest toward state? Wait for those responses to come flying through. Pleasure, correct. And soon it is pleasure. Our strongest toward state is lust. We often confuse it with love, but the reason it's lust and not love is love takes time. Love is a combination of 3 hormones, oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine, whereas lust is instantaneous. Correct on connection die. I'm going to come back to that at the end, but lust often leads us to do foolish things. I think we've all been in a position where lust has made us make a poor decision or question our decision making. Now, what we need to understand about the brain is we have away states, threats. These are primary threats likely to hurt me. And we have toward states, rewards. These are primary rewards likely to keep me alive. The fundamental organizational principle of the brain at all times is to minimize threat and to maximize reward. So in every moment of our life, that's what we're trying to do. Minimize threat, maximize reward. Okay, so because of that, we need to understand a little bit about change and cognition. So change is a really uncomfortable process. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but it's very neurologically actually natural. It's part of cognition. So what we really need to understand is the brain and the human mind is a connection and really a prediction machine. What this means is we love to predict outcomes. So the brain is a pattern recognition trying to the near future. What this means is when we can predict outcomes, when we can anticipate what's going to happen next accurately, we feel safe and secure. We don't have a primary threat state, we have a primary toward state. What that means is we know what's going to happen and therefore we're less likely to be threatened in that situation. However, when change comes into the mix, it disrupts that natural process. The patterns, the behavioural processes, the hierarchies and habits that we've formed become disrupted when change occurs. And what that means is even though we spent time streamlining perhaps these social habits or these behavioural habits in the workplace, if change comes into the mix, our brain's natural default sometimes gets questioned. And that makes us feel really uncomfortable. Now, I just want you to think about a time when you've been at work and suddenly the process has changed or something's changed you weren't expecting. Now, think about, did you handle that well, or did you get that sort of quick turn in your stomach, a little bit of heightened anxiety, a little bit of sweaty palms, a little bit of defensiveness about why it had changed or what the reason was, a little bit of anger or frustration? Now, that's normal, but that's a demonstration that our brain loves to connect and predict, and when it can't, we get that little bit of friction. So what we need to understand if we're going to understand a little bit about change is the way in which processing, cognition, what we're conscious of and not conscious of actually works. So I'm going to break down those 2 parts of the brain, 2 parts of the brain, and how this interplay between those 2 really relates to change, but also to cognition, and how understanding these parts of the brain and how change works, we can change our mind and also encourage positive change with others in the workplace. And as we know, because SparkFest is all about innovation, that's what leads to innovation. A change in thinking, a change in approach is what allows different, innovative and creative ideas to be generated. If we create something in the space in which it was founded without any different approaches, we're not going to get different. So let's quickly talk about our conscious and our unconscious mind. We have our prefrontal cortex and we have our limbic system. And these two things have a relationship with each other. What we're mostly cognizant of sits in our prefrontal cortex here, part of our neocortex. And what we need to understand about this part of our brain is it's our executive functioning, our higher order thinking, deciding, attentional control. It basically tells us what we should focus on and not focus on. Our memorizing and recalling, our working memory lives in here. And we also have our inhibition, our braking system. This is the thing that allows us to hold our tongue when we really want to tell our parents or perhaps our relatives or our colleagues how we feel, but we know socially that's probably not the best thing to do. Now, this part of the mind is what we're most conscious of, and what we need to understand about it is these three things. So it is energy intensive. So if you've ever got hangry before, come on, be honest. If you've got hangry, why? Your prefrontal cortex is hugely energy intensive. It requires a lot of glucose, a lot of oxygen. When we yawn, what we're trying to do is get oxygen to that prefrontal cortex because we need energy to process. This higher order thinking is often hugely taxing on the system. And what that means is it takes a lot for us to use our inhibition, for us to use our critical thought processing. It's a lot easier for us when change occurs for us to get frustrated. But when we use prefrontal thinking, what we're doing is saying, stay calm, stay cool, focus on the task at hand. And that requires a lot of energy, which probably will make sense as often why we don't do it. The other thing we need to understand is it's small and serial. Now, for all us busy folk on the line, I have no doubt that you're all multitaskers. And what I'm here to tell you is that multitasking is a myth. The prefrontal cortex can actually only do one thing at one time. So if we try to multitask, respond to a text message, have a conversation with a colleague, think about strategic planning, think of a brief from a meeting, what we actually do is reduce our cognitive capabilities. So we can actually only do literally one thing at one time well. Now, we can do other things, but what we do is end up splitting energy and resources. So if you think about driving your car, of course you can drive your car and you can sing along to your favourite Beyonce song and potentially think about where you need to go. Now, what we see here is a distribution of resources. Think about this as your executive functioning, the executive team in your brain. They outsource tasks into other areas of the brain. So in the driving analogy, what we're seeing is the basal ganglia responsible for motor neurons and movement is doing the driving. Your memory, your short-term memory, which lives in your hippocampus, is remembering the lyrics to Beyonce. And then part of your prefrontal and another part of your brain, your hippocampus, is doing the navigation. So it's not that you're doing all things at once, it's that you've distributed resources, and that distribution comes from this part of our mind. The ability basically to do one thing at one time. Okay, so, and what you just saw there, by the way, was me trying to do two things at once. I tried to read a question and continue talking, and you saw that I slowed down. So even though we know this, even though I know this and have spent years in this area of research, we still try and do it. So when it comes to change, what we have to realize is if we're going to get on top of change, we've got to be in the moment, focusing on one thing at one time. And the last thing we need to know about the conscious mind is that inhibition. We have this braking system, and that's more advanced than every other species in the animal kingdom. And this is really important when it comes to change, because if we can really understand that we are in control of how we respond to change versus in control of change itself through the way that we act or don't act, change becomes far less fearful, becomes far less threatening, because we take back control. That connection and prediction machine is about having control. And if we actually understand that we have inhibition to control how we respond, and therefore we are in control, change isn't so scary. We're going to go into that later on. Now let's move to our limbic system. Now, limbic system is responsible for many functions, but what we're going to be focusing on here is our emotional lives and emotional regulation. But there are many other areas and higher functions such as formation of memories and learning that happen in this area. Now, what we're going to focus on today is a part of our mind that constantly scans and prioritizes for threat. Now, this part of our mind, some of us might have heard of before, and it's a part of our mind that regulates fight and flight. And this part of our brain is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is called the amygdala because it's Latin for almond, and it's an almond-sized shape. You actually have two amygdalae that sit on both sides. They're connected to the prefrontal cortex and also your visual cortex, your eyes. And what this part of our brain does is it's responsible for regulating emotions and threat. Now remember, we're 4 times more likely to see threat than we are reward. And what happens in those moments is our amygdala has a direct line to our prefrontal cortex. So when we're aware of threats and worry, it's because our amygdala is kind of knocking at the door of our prefrontal cortex and saying, hey, I think we should be a little bit concerned about this sudden org structure and change because maybe our job's under threat. Now, what we need to understand about the fact when the amygdala enters into the conversation, knocking at the door of the prefrontal cortex, what neurologically is happening is it's getting bigger, it's growing in size, and it's actually increasing in blood flow. And what this often does, if we think about threat states, is makes the situation more threatening than it actually needs to be. So if we go through that analogy, there's been an org structure, a reorg at work, and I'm contemplating what does this mean for my fate or future. What we see neurologically in terms of processing is we see energy move away from our higher order thinking, our ability to stay calm, cool, collected, and in control, our ability to say the right thing at the right time, to hold our tongue when we want to say something but we know we shouldn't. And what we see is our ability to do that decreases because energy away from the prefrontal cortex because of the change and the threat that's coming and to our limbic system. And in these moments, we become more emotional. What actually happens is we get tunnel vision. So if you've ever heard of tunnel vision before, this is where it comes from. And we literally narrow our eyes. And what our brain starts to do is go into the detail, the problem, the worst case scenario type of planning, and really drama. And so we get caught up in those stories. And what that means is we actually stop looking at what's going on around us because we're using less executive functioning, less ability to problem solve and critically think our way out of this. Now, this is really important when it comes to change, and particularly a change program or change in the workplace. And it's important because of this reason. Physical threats and emotional threats, social threats, are the same to the brain. So let's put this into a work context. The sentence, "Can I give you some feedback?" is neurologically the same as someone walking behind you in a darkened car park. To your brain, it knows no difference. So the old adage that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me is neurologically inaccurate. What we have to understand is when change comes into the mix, I'm anticipating outcome A, but outcome B is what we've got. It naturally disrupts the process of our thought processing. And that means we feel threat because we can't control or we don't have an existing program or pattern that we can upload into this situation. So when it comes to change in the workplace, we're going to change the way we're doing things. We're going to change the way we're going to approach problem solving. Most of us naturally reassess and become threatened by that. That's really normal. Conversely, when someone says something positive and that word of feedback becomes positive reinforcement, we feel that reward state, that connection. We touched on connection before in some of those answers. When that positive feedback is driven, that threat disappears. But rest assured, the way I give you some feedback, we're going to look at reassessing the way we do things. We're changing up the innovation team. All cause that initial tightening of the chest, tightening of the hands, shoulders go up, scapula come up, tummy might start to churn. So it kind of looks a little bit like this. We worry at first, but then we feel happy when the feedback is positive. But what if the feedback isn't positive? And if the change is something we're not anticipating? And if the change, perhaps like 2020 and global pandemic, was nothing that 2019 could have prepared us for, what we often see is our team members who are meant to help us guide through that change become the threat. And so we see reactions like this in the workplace: sweating, under pressure, we're worried, we don't know if it's friend or foe, we don't know if my colleague's out to take my job, we don't know if someone's on my side. And because of that, change becomes a really uncomfortable process. So what we need to understand is we don't need to change itself. We need to change the way we think about change and respond to change. It's a constant, it's a part of life. It's not going to get any easier. What we get better at is responding to change, and that makes change easier. So we need to understand, though, that there are really big cognitive effects of this. So if we think about the impact, the cognitive impact that change has on us, what we sort of see are these things happening. So initially what we'll see if there's change that we're not anticipating, we see a reduction in prefrontal activity, an increase in limbic and primal emotional behaviours. That amygdala grows in size, the amygdala that regulates fight and flight. What that means is we become less of the defensive rock and we start to worry people on my side. And what we also see is an increase in threats, in perceived threats in situation in relation to experiences. Now, what that means is we see more threat than is actually there. So when somebody says, can I give you some feedback? Our automatic default is to go, that's scary and worrying. So now I'm playing out scenarios of, gosh, I didn't send that email to that client on time, or, oh my goodness, it's probably about that time that I didn't listen or take notes properly in that board. And so we create more fear around change itself. And this really negatively impacts on productivity, collaboration, performance within a team. And on an individual level, it increases our memory errors, where we don't actually recall things properly. And because we're already looking for a negative connotation, what is normally a neutral stimulus or even a positive stimulus can be taken as negative. So I want to be really clear with everyone on the line that everyone's response to change looks a little bit like this. We don't like it. We're not anticipating it. It makes us uncomfortable. But if you apply the right tools that I'm about to walk you through, if we allow ourselves more prefrontal thinking, more control, inhibition, collective thought, collective understanding in the workplace, we take this initial reaction from change and we can turn it into one of these reactions, where we really learn to roll with the punches and understand that change itself isn't something we need to fear. So let's launch straight into that. Let's talk about how we make that happen. And so these are our neurohacks, our neurotools to enhance internal change. So what I want to be really clear about here, team, is that you cannot change anything out there, external, other people's behaviours, situations, scenarios, unless you are aware of what's happening in here. Because nothing out there can make anything happen inside your mind, internally, without your permission. So if we're going to get better at responding to change out there in the workplace, in the world, things that we actually can't control, we've got to get better at controlling in here. So when we talk about change, we've got to start with internal change. How can we control our mind and respond to change in an effective way? Now, when we talk about change, we can't go past this principle. And this is a principle of something called neuroplasticity. Now, I've been talking for a lot. I'm keen to take a break and more importantly, keen to get you guys back into the conversation. So here we're going to do our polls. The team are really going to help us with this in the background. And our first poll is actually a question to you. And that is, what is neuroplasticity? So in a moment, you'll see the poll launch and you'll have 3 options to choose from. Remember that nobody sees your response. It's just an aggregation of the data. So an aggregation of what most people say in a percentage. So nobody's going to know what you answer. Just answer with what you think neuroplasticity is and what you've heard of this term before. Now that should launch in a sec, team. If it doesn't, just give us a holler in the chat and we'll make that happen. Okay. Should be launching in the next little second. Okay, we're going to leave that open if it is launched for about another 20 seconds, if that's okay. Then we're going to move straight through that, because I'm conscious to get on time and conscious that everybody have a chance for Q&A as well. Okay. Perfect. So if we're able to close that poll down and share the results in the next 10 seconds, that would be awesome. All right. So I think that's worked. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's coming back in terms of data. So I think we're just going to have to keep pushing on with this one. So the options that we put in that poll were: the brain can change, and humans are the only species that can do this. The brain can change, but only up until our mid-20s. Or the brain can change and it continues to evolve throughout our lifetime. Now, if you'd responded with option 3, you are correct. Neuroplasticity basically means that the brain and the central nervous system are malleable. and it can be rewired in responses to experiences throughout your lifetime. What we need to understand is that we all have a neuroplastic brain, a brain that's capable of change. And this is the really important part. It's capable of change until your final breath. So even those with neurological disorder, disease, degeneration, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all have a neuroplastic brain. We are all capable of driving neuroplasticity, the ability to change our cognition, the way that neurons, brain cells, come together and form connections which dictate our cognition, which dictate our actions. We are all actually in control of that. And it is a natural, normal, neurological thing for us to be able to change and adapt. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that change is possible. But yet this inserts the irony of the human mind. If we have this amazing neuroplastic brain and we're designed to change and we're plastic until we die and we really are just change agents, why is change so difficult? Why do we resist change? And you don't need to look far in a corporate setting or in a business context to hear these words of that's just the way we do things, or that's the way we've always done things, or why would we change it? If it's not broken, why do we need to change it? And this is the most important thing to understand, because change, when it's embraced, is what drives innovation. Change is not waiting for something externally to happen. It's using internal thought processes, predictions, and critical thinking, and our ability to forecast the future, which is so iconically and incredibly human, that when we can capitalize on that, change becomes an easier process. But that irony still remains. So let me use this analogy to break it down for you, because it is a complicated one. The human mind is quite the enigma. So hopefully there's some skiers or some snowboarders on the line. Now we're going to use the chat function again for this, folks. So have the chat function open. I'm going to ask you some questions about skiing and snowboarding. Even if you're not a skier or a snowboarder, you'll still be able to understand this analogy and it will still work. And this explains why change is so difficult, but how we can also capitalize on neuroplasticity to help drive change within ourselves that then drives change outside of ourselves. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you're at a run in powder snow. Not slushy Australian stuff. I want you to think about powder snow. Think Colorado, Hokkaido, Swiss Alps. Think deep powder snow either up to your knees or your hips. So it's 7 a.m. and you and your family and friends are about to hit the run. In powder snow, as you carve down the mountainside, will you be moving quickly or slowly? In powder snow, are you moving quickly or slowly? Using the chat function, tell me what you think. Are we moving quickly or slowly? In powder snow, are we moving quickly or slowly? Using the chat function, team, what do we think in powder snow? While we do that, I'm just going to grab a little extra water. So are we moving quickly or slowly as we carve down the mountainside? Okay. Slowly, slowly, quickly, quickly, slowly. Okay, we're pretty evenly split here. Quickly. In powder snow, moving quickly, so many considerations happening in real time, correct? Okay, so both, okay, potentially both, Stu. Here's the deal. In powder snow, you're more likely to be moving slowly. The reason you're moving slowly is you have to apply a lot of force to break down the matter, the snow, which is in front of you. So it requires a lot of effort from your body to carve and switch and push through that powder to make it compact so you can accelerate your speed. Now let's think about the same run, but 4 p.m. that day. And 300 other people have gone down that run. So as you come up to the mountainside again on 4 p.m. that day, but 300 other people have already laid their tracks down, are you now moving slower or quicker? Using the chat function, if we think about 4 p.m., 300 other people down the run, are we moving slower or quicker? What do we think, team? Are we moving slower or quicker? Waiting for those responses for fastest finger. I think everyone's a bit shy now with this analogy. Will we be moving quicker or slower? Correct. So Dwight, Mel, you are correct. We're moving quicker. And the reason we're moving quicker is that 300 other people have compressed that snow. They've used their force and energy to push through that matter. And because of that, that matter has started to flatten. And because it starts to flatten, it's starting to become more shallow. And because it's gone down in size, it's easier for us to move through. Now, your brain works in exactly the same way. Your brain is made up of a series of maps and pathways called synapses, where neurons, brain cells, with the support of cells, come together and connect. And these connections, these junctions, are where things like neurotransmitters, proteins are exchanged across the synapse. And in this exchange is what drives cognition. It's what drives change itself. What we need to understand is because our brain's number one job is to keep us alive, it wants to minimize processing power. And so because of that, it takes the path of least resistance. It takes the practice habits, experiences, processes, existing knowledge we have to guide cognition, to make that prediction. To make a prediction of what's coming next, we use existing connections. However, when it comes to change, there's often not an existing pathway, an existing process for how we run down the mountain. And so that's what causes discomfort. That's what causes us to resist change, because we have to move a lot of neurological energy and connection points and reorganize them. But rest assured, because we are human, and because we have a plastic brain, we can move those connections anytime. And one of the biggest catalysts towards change is the way we think about it. Now, what we need to understand is cognition is incredibly powerful. And cognition is incredibly powerful because of the way we talk to ourselves. Our internal dialogue can dictate neuroplastic changes, the way those synapses come together, as equally to the equal efficacy as real-time experiences. And that's because of this principle. Doing and imagining are the same to the brain. When we imagine a situation within our mind, either going well or poorly, we can actually form connections and pathways which dictate cognition to equal effect as outside actual experiences. So if I imagine change being a terrible thing because last time there was a reorg, I lost my position, what I'm doing is now imagining that's the same here. So I'm building a path where it's the same here. And so I'm pushing that into reality, and that's what I'm seeing and creating. And because I'm thinking about that pathway is becoming further etched. More people are traveling down the mountain, more connection points are starting to form, and it becomes stronger. What we need to understand is the way we think about things internally, internal change, is what dictates how we respond to external change. And that's because our self-talk, part of our self-talk, which is governed by an area of our brain called our frontal gyrus, is really influential in how those connection points come together. So our imagination, our ability to visualize, to create, to think and predict the future is a really strong determinant of what connections come together. So what we need to understand is that we're really in control of this. So how this really breaks down is that change itself must start with choice. So we must make the choice to change. Change is going to happen to us, or it can happen for us. When we realize that some changes are actually happening for us, what we do is turn off autopilot. What this means is we have a default mode of how we're going to go down the mountain. Suddenly a hazard of not being able to go that way. What we're seeing is a thinking in the moment. Turning off autopilot is our default mode is to always think of change as threat and worry. If we boost our self-awareness by increasing our prefrontal thinking, being aware of the fact that maybe this change isn't so bad, maybe this is a positive change, and we become more aware of how we're responding, we also become more socially aware. Now, if we think about change and innovation, this is really important because no change can be driven by an individual alone, and no innovative ideas get up by one inventor. They get up by a team of individuals coming together to a collective goal. And that self-awareness is really important at driving social awareness. So how do we do this? How do we become self-aware, so therefore we become socially aware, so therefore we can make that positive choice to change and see change as opportunity and not threat? We actually have everything we need to do this within us. And it's through a simple process of something called metacognition. When we think about our thinking and choose to think through a process of metacognition, we can form those neuroplastic changes. We are able to form conscious neuroplasticity. Now remember that change will be accelerated by choice and motivation. Now how we do this, how we respond effectively, is by making the choice to change. And that really comes from this idea of reframing. We're not trying to change the external. We're not trying to say that 2020's been nothing but a bin fire. We're not pretending about that. What we're trying to do is saying, if it is a bin fire, what resources do I have to put it out? So rather than get angry that the bin's on fire, because that's actually fully beyond our control, what tools are in my arsenal that I can do to reduce the fuel to the flames? Staying home, social distancing, wearing a mask when I need to in inappropriate areas, working from home, drumming up different areas of work, assisting my colleagues in a different way. Now, what this does is form neuroplastic surgery. This thought process, this simple action of thinking differently and external, reframes the internal, and that allows us to change up that cognition, which allows us to brace change. So how do we do that? We use this neuroplastic situation, we use this tool, and this is our reframing the situation tool. And the reason asking a different question leads to a different outcome is because the brain seeks to answer the question it's been asked. If you ask about how this is so messed up and the bin fire of 2020 is still on fire and it's getting bigger, all you do is exacerbate the drama and the detail. All you do is push limbic amygdala thinking. Whereas if you look at the bin fire and think, how can I solve this? What can I do differently? How is this an opportunity to potentially be the phoenix and rise from the ashes? Your brain will flick into prefrontal thinking, which reduces the threat of change, because what we're able to do in that moment is get better at connecting and predicting outcomes. When we look at problem solving and how we're going to respond versus this is happening to me, the how demonstrates we are back in control. So these simple 4 questions allows us to do that whenever we get those prickly feelings of change, things that we weren't anticipating. So your neuroplastic tool allows you to reframe. Because we have a neuroplastic mind, when we use metacognition, thinking about our thinking, we're able to increase our self-awareness, carve a different pathway down the mountainside. And because of that, we become aware of how we're responding, we become more aware of others. And that's really important for external change when we think about external change. So moving to the last bit of external change, now we know how we're going to change ourselves internally. We can use metacognition because of our neuroplastic mind. What can we do to help change become less scary to everyone outside of us? What can we do to unite folk around the way we have to change internally to drive innovative outcomes? So it's a pretty simple process again. Internal change leads to external. You can't control anyone but you. So what we've got to do here is we know autopilot, use metacognition, drive self-awareness. That's going to dial up our self-awareness, which drives our social awareness. The more aware we become of ourselves, our own behaviours, our own blockers to change, our own resistance, the better we become at seeing blockers and resistance in others, and the better that we can come together and work through them collectively. Now, what we need to understand a little bit about this is that change and problem solving really dictates the way that we think about thinking. So what we need to understand is when we think about a situation, there's 2 different systems that play into this. And this is part of our prefrontal cortex. What we need to understand is we actually have something called bottom-up and top-down processing, part of cognition that allows us to create reality. So bottom-up processing is our incoming situational stimulus, the perceptual experience that we're feeling. This is us looking at the bin fire of 2020 and saying, oh my goodness, this is on fire. What am I going to do about this? This is internally with top-down processing, conceptually driven processing, our existing expectations and beliefs. Our existing expectation and belief was that 2020 was meant to look pretty similar to 2019, and this is completely different. So on one side, you have and this forms reality. So what this means is at any given moment, this is happening on an individual level. I'm taking in an experience, I'm sitting in a change management meeting with my team, I'm thinking about the new innovative project we've got to launch, I'm thinking about what other people are saying, what basically they're saying translate to what I'm hearing. But what I'm hearing is dictated by my own unique top-down processing. So what I'm hearing is we're going to run a change program, we're going to launch a new lab, and maybe I'm going, we did this 3 years ago and it didn't work. We've already done this, it didn't work. So my reality merges into, we're talking about an idea that isn't going to work. Now remember that experience is unique to me. So my colleague across the Nathan might be saying, well, yeah, this sounds like a great idea because maybe they weren't here 3 years ago. Or maybe my colleague Kumar across the way says, I did this before and this worked really well and this type of structure really appeals to this type of customer. Their top-down processing is different to ours. So this is why you can all be in the same meeting and hear completely different things and have completely different experiences. So bottom-up processing is the content. Top-down processing is the context that's unique to us. And this is what allows us to form reality. Now, this is really important to change because what we have to understand is that people respond differently to change because of their unique experience. The context in which the content being delivered to them becomes wrapped around. Now, we can use this to our advantage. We can't change the top-down processing of someone internally. We can't go into their mind and wire it the way that we want it to be wired. That would be creepy on many levels. But what we can do is use the content in a really effective way. Now, this is going to be our last poll that we're going to launch. And if we're able to get that up and running, that would be great. If the poll didn't work last time, team, maybe just tell us in the chat and we can sort that out. We can move quickly through this process. But the question that should be in the poll for all of you is, what neurological capability sets us apart from every other species in the animal kingdom? Now, this is important. I'm not just asking you random questions for no reason. This really relates into how we can encourage other people to come on that journey of change with us versus change being something that's happening to them. So if we're able to launch the poll in the background, that would be great. If we're not able to see that, team, please let us know in the chat. Maybe if you are able to see it, please also let us know. So the poll question that should be there is, what neurological capability sets us apart from every other species in the animal kingdom? Is it social relationships? Is it language or problem solving? Okay. So that poll should be up there. New poll hasn't loaded, all polls are there. I think it should just be up there in a second. Thank you, Jen. Should give you about another 10 seconds. Okay, updated now. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to leave it open for about 15 seconds, team. So if we can do 15 seconds in there, and then we'll move on quickly because I think we're going to fall back a bit of time for Q&A. Okay. Awesome. So if we could close that poll down now, that would be fab. I can't see the responses there yet, but I'm quickly going to progress through this so we can get to the end of this presentation with a little bit of Q&A. So what we need to understand is the neurological capability that sets us apart from every other species on the planet is very much language. It's our sophisticated ability using our Wernicke's and Broca area of our mind, the ability to hear language, translate it into meaning, and then use our tongue and our mouth to create sounds that then translate meaning back. And that's true whether or not language looks like this or like this. Whether or not we've used a scroll in ink or we've written lines of code which demonstrate and articulate communication in a digital format. What we need to understand is that communication and change are critical for success. So communication with others, the way in which we communicate change, the way in which we bring people on board is how we encourage the right external change to. What we need to understand about this is language is the scaffold which allows us to problem solve, ideate, and acquire abstract concepts. It's what allows us to make sense of the world. Our sophisticated processing of language dovetails into the fact that we're social creatures. We desire connection and we desire conversation. So when change is occurring, if we reach out, connect, and talk about it, change doesn't feel so scary. Now, what you also need to remember is we talked about the fact that social threat and emotional threat are the same. What you need to know is that all language communication has some element of emotional processing and context. What this means is that anything you say touches on the emotional responses of another person, even if that emotional response is ambivalent. And I know that at this point, most people, when I say that we're all emotional, give me this kind of response. Yeah, like, okay, sure, that's all those other emotional people. That's not me. I'm really rational and logical. I'm sorry, if you're human, you are emotional. Emotions and our cognition over thousands of years have dovetailed together to form neurological chemical reactions when we speak or don't speak. And what we say generates those threats or towards response in the same way that physical threats and physical affection can generate those responses. So we need to understand that language is the gift that we can use to pull together that change, to be the glue that binds emotion and cognition together and thereby dictates our interactions, actions, and behaviours, dictates how we respond to change and whether or not it's positive or negative. So language and the way we use language, the way we connect and respond and talk about change dictates whether or not it's successful or threatening. Now, hopefully now seeing this, that makes sense. So our last tool which allows us to do that is called our change catalyzer framework. And our change catalyzer framework breaks down into 3 steps. What we really want to do is when we talk to people, we want to acknowledge that they have choice. And what we mean by choice is really encourage them to understand and reframe. Now, the same way that we can reframe internally, we can use language to encourage a reframe within another person. Ask them to see it differently. Allow them to see the multiplicity of the situation or the different angles. And if we collaborate, bring them into the conversation, remind them that, hey, in this reorg, you're not on your own. You know, there's many people going through this change, and we're here to look after what is in your best interest and being transparent in that process. That's interaction versus disconnection. And that collaboration means that that threat isn't so strong. So then if we demonstrate commitment, we monitor that change. If we're running an internal change program, we keep people aware of what's happening. We commit to milestones. We bring structure and order so we can better predict the outcome. That's where we see change reduce in its severity. So these 3 simple steps break down into how you can have this conversation in the second part of your change catalyzer. Allow us to externally drive change within another by using our advanced and very iconically human capabilities of language. Now, I'm going to leave you on this last quote, and I think this perfectly sums up change before we move to some Q&A. All change starts with choice. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that there's so many things beyond our control. But it also has dictated to us that the choice of our behaviours, our actions, our thought processes dictates whether or not this pandemic becomes an absolute blowout or whether or not it can be managed in some way. The choice of our behaviours and actions has what's dictated that success or that challenge. And it's true for innovation. All change is uncomfortable. Nobody likes it. But through our choice, through active reframing, metacognition, and using language in a positive way, we can actively and positively respond to change. All right, team, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for joining us today. As mentioned, if you did want to get access to that digital workbook, my email is down there. Please shoot us a note and we can send that resource over to you. Conscious of time, if you do need to get off to something else or you're attending any of the other awesome SparkFest events this week, please feel free to disappear. If you did want to hang around, I will respond to some of the questions in Q&A. If there isn't anything particular though, I'm very happy to hand back. So I'm going to wait for the moment. If folk have to drop off, that's completely fine. Otherwise, please pop your questions in Q&A and not in chat, just so we can better respond to them and also keep track of them. Thank you, Sarah, for your. Can you please email us directly, because we're about to lose this window, and I don't want that to go there. So I'm just going to put my email address in the chat because some people are saying that they can't read it properly. So here is us. If you wanted to send us a request for that digital workbook, It's there. If for some reason you can't find that email address, you're very welcome to come to the website where we have a chat function. The team can triage you to the right spot. But there is our email address again. I'm just going to Q&A. Cool, so I've got a question from Jen. When introducing change into a client organisation, how do you approach the group's likelihood of being open to discuss? So what you're looking to do wherever you're assessing likelihood or discuss open change is to ask that question. What's the mood? If I'm temperature guessing, if I'm picking up on the vibe, it has to respond to change. Ask the direct question. I wouldn't be afraid of asking the direct question about how open to change. When has change worked well? Have there been any challenges? More importantly, because if you understand that, then you can better assist them in change. You're not being accusatory, you're not being suggestive, you're not being judgmental. You're really just trying to understand how this organisation is acclimatised to change, if at all. And those direct questions, I think, definitely have meaning. Hopefully that answers that for you, Jen. Okay. Di, how can we help colleagues ourselves who have overconfidence, lack insight, humility to even think about their own behaviour? So again, it comes back to first principles. What we're looking for is to encourage thought processes within that individual. So what you want to remind them is they are part of a collective, they're part of a team, they're part of an organisation. And it's the success of the organisation, not the individual, that determines overall success. Now, that's a cultural piece that can take time, but tools like the ones I've just mentioned to you, so that neuroplastic reframing, those questions, posing the question back to individuals about, well, how do you think X feels about those decisions? If you were, Y, how would you feel? I'm just a bit conscious we're on time there, and I think I might get bumped out of here. But if you do have any questions that I wasn't able to answer for you, please do send me an email and I'm very happy to respond. Again, if you would like the ebook, please do send it on to us in an email just so we can keep track of that. There's a couple of requests coming through and we don't want to miss you. I think I need to log out of all of this now, team, but thank you so much for sharing your Monday morning with us. Remember, you always have a choice about change and you're very much able to dictate that through your thought process. If there's anything else that we can answer for you, you can find us at that email address below, or you can connect with us on any of those social platforms for any upcoming events that we'd be speaking at. I'm going to wish you all a wonderful Monday. Please stay safe and well, and remember, you always have the capability to change. All it starts with is choice.